The house was unquiet. A tension that had been building for weeks finally coming to a head. Raymond sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. He hadn't taken a sip in the last 15 minutes. The warmth of the cup did nothing to ease the chill he felt creeping through his body. Something was wrong. He had sensed it for a while now. Sandra had become distant, more aloof than usual. The warmth that had once characterized their conversations was gone, replaced with brief exchanges and evasive answers. He tried convincing himself that it was just a phase. After all, every marriage has its rough patches. Doesn't it? He had chalked it up to work stress or maybe personal issues she wasn't ready to share. But now, sitting there alone at the table, he knew that tonight something was going to change. He could feel it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Sandra's footsteps approaching. Each click of her heels grew louder and sharper. She walked into the dining room with an unsettling confidence, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Raymond looked up from his cup, his unease growing. And then he noticed the man following her. The stranger walked in with a cocky swagger, his broad frame filling the doorway as if he owned the place. He stood beside Sandra, arms crossed, to smirk, almost daring Raymond to react. Raymond's stomach dropped. He set his coffee cup down carefully, his hand trembling slightly as his eyes flicked from his wife to the man who seemed far too comfortable in their home. Sandra was the first to speak. Her voice unnaturally cold, she began, "Raymond," not even bothering to sit down. "This is Daniel," she paused, letting the words hang in the air. "My lover. He wants you to share me with him, and you can't refuse, otherwise he will break your jaw." Raymond blinked, stunned into silence. His mind scrambled to make sense of what she had just said. "Lover." He looked at Sandra, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke, but there was none. Her expression was hard, calculated. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His throat felt tight, like it was closing up. Daniel stepped forward, his grin widening as if he was relishing Raymond's confusion. "Yeah, that's right, man," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "She's been with me for a while now, and she's not leaving me." Raymond's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Sandra, desperate for some kind of explanation. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice cracking. Sandra didn't flinch. "It is," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "We've been together for months, Raymond. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how." The room seemed to spin for a moment as Raymond tried to grasp the gravity of her words. "Months?" he muttered to himself, as if saying it aloud would help it make sense. "Why, Sandra? Why would you do this?" "I wasn't happy," she answered quickly, as though she had been preparing for this conversation for weeks. "You and I were not the same anymore. I needed something more, someone who could give me what I've been missing." Daniel, still standing close to Sandra, chuckled. She needs a real alpha man. Raymond, someone who can take care of her the way you never could." Raymond's hands tightened around the edge of the table. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. "So what now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely holding steady. "You brought him here to tell me you're leaving me," Sandra said. She shook her head. "No, Raymond, I'm not leaving you. We've decided that Daniel's going to stay. He'll be a part of our lives." Raymond's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Daniel stepped forward again, leaning in close enough that Raymond could smell the faint scent of cologne and arrogance. "It's simple," he said, his voice low and threatening. "She wants both of us, and you're going to accept that or else." Raymond's jaw clenched as Daniel's threat hung in the air. "Or else what?" he asked, standing up from the table slowly, his body tense. Daniel's smirk deepened. "Or else, like she said, I'll break your jaw, loser. You better get the hell out and let me do your wife." For a moment, there was a thick, dangerous silence. Raymond could feel the weight of the threat pressing down on him. His mind raced as he looked at Sandra, searching her face for some trace of the woman he had married. But there was nothing there. No guilt, No shame, just cold indifference. "You're serious about this?" Raymond asked, his voice hollow. "You really think this is okay?" Sandra shrugged. "It is what it is, Raymond. This is the way things are now." Daniel laughed, stepping back as if to give Raymond room to process the reality of the situation. "You better just get used to it, man. I'm here to stay." Raymond stood there for a moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He felt a wave of anger rise up in his chest, but he forced himself to push it down. He knew that reacting in the heat of the moment wouldn't help him. These two wanted to see him crumble, wanted to watch him break. Instead, Raymond took a deep breath, his face expressionless. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sandra and Daniel behind. As he walked down the hallway, their laughter echoed behind him, mocking him. He passed by the pictures hanging on the walls, snapshots of happier times, memories of a life that now felt like a cruel joke. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, but his mind was racing. He entered the bathroom and locked the door behind him. His back pressed against the cool tile as he took a moment to steady himself. His heart was pounding, his hands trembling, as he stared into the mirror. His reflection looked pale, broken, nothing like the man he once was. For a moment, he felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. His marriage, his life, his dignity. It had all been taken from him in an instant. But as he stood there, something inside him shifted. The shock, the betrayal, the humiliation. It all began to harden into something else, something cold. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a brief moment, before turning on the faucet, letting the sound of running water fill the small room. The toilet flushed as Raymond composed himself, his face becoming unreadable. He had spent years being the quiet, accommodating husband, always the one to compromise, always the one to keep the peace. But now, standing there in the quiet bathroom, he knew that was over. When he finally stepped out of the bathroom, his mind was calm, his heart steady. As he walked back into the living room, Sandra and Daniel were still lounging on the couch, their conversation interrupted only by the sound of his return. Raymond didn't speak. Instead, he carried a small black bag in his hand, one that neither Sandra nor Daniel had seen before. He placed it gently on the coffee table in front of them, his movements slow and deliberate. "What's that?" Daniel asked, his cocky demeanor faltering for the first time. Raymond didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, looking at them, his face expressionless. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. He wasn't sure they had noticed it yet, but they would. Daniel stood up, his earlier confidence now tinged with uncertainty. "I asked you a question," he growled. "What's in the bag?" Raymond met his eyes unblinking. "You'll find out soon enough," he said quietly. Sandra shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her eyes flicking between the bag and Raymond's face. "Raymond, what are you doing?" Raymond didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the front door. He could feel their eyes on his back, could hear Daniel's voice as he called after him, but he didn't stop. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in weeks, Raymond felt like he was in control. Raymond re-entered the living room, his face unreadable. Sandra and Daniel were now seated together on the couch, their laughter fading into silence as they noticed his presence. Daniel's arm was casually draped over Sandra's shoulder, but the smirk he had worn earlier flickered when his eyes landed on the small black bag in Raymond's hand. "What's that?" Daniel's tone still carried an air of arrogance, but now it was tinged with a trace of uncertainty. Raymond ignored him, walking slowly to the coffee table. His movements were deliberate, methodical, as if the moment had been rehearsed in his mind for weeks. Without a word, he set the bag down and began to open it. The soft thud of the bag hitting the table was the only sound in the room, the tension building with each passing second. Sandra's breath caught when she saw the contents inside the bag. Her phone, a USB drive, and a folder stuffed with documents. Her pulse quickened as a wave of panic swept through her. Daniel shifted in his seat, sitting up straighter. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his bravado faltering as he glanced at Sandra, who was frozen, her eyes locked on the folder. Raymond's voice was calm but devoid of any warmth. "I've been preparing for this day," he said, his eyes never leaving theirs. "I knew you were cheating, Sandra, for months. I've been watching. I've known everything." Sandra's stomach twisted, and her hands instinctively clenched the edge of the couch. "Raymond, you don't understand," she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. I understand perfectly." Raymond cut her off, his voice firm and steady. "You think I'm blind? You think I didn't notice the late nights, those secret texts, the sudden interest in going out with friends? I gave you the benefit of the doubt, but when the pieces didn't add up, I started looking. And what I found," he gestured to the folder, "was more than enough." Daniel snorted, trying to regain his composure. "You think some folder full of crap is going to scare me? You're just a sad, pathetic man trying to cling to a woman who doesn't want you anymore." Raymond's gaze shifted to Daniel, but his expression remained neutral. "You're right about one thing, Daniel. Sandra doesn't want me, but this isn't about getting her back. This," he tapped the folder, "is about making sure neither of you ever forget what you've done." Sandra's heart was racing, her mind scrambling for a way out of the situation. "Raymond, please," she said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't have to go any further. We've ended this. We're way past that." Raymond interrupted, his tone hard. He pulled the paper from the folder and held it up. "This is a full account of your affair, every message, every hotel booking, every lie. I have months of evidence. I wasn't just sitting around hoping you'd come clean. I was preparing." Sandra's face went pale. You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting myself," Raymond corrected, placing the paper back in the folder. "And it's a good thing I did, because now I have everything I need." Daniel scoffed, leaning back into the couch. "You really think you can do anything to me? You're delusional." Raymond's eyes flicked to Daniel, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? But you're not. You have a lot to lose, Daniel, that cushy job of yours, your spotless reputation. All of it. I did my research. Turns out your company doesn't look too kindly on executives who engage in unethical behavior, and the people you work for? Let's just say they won't appreciate the kind of scandal you're involved in." Daniel's confidence wavered as Raymond's words sank in. "What are you talking about?" Raymond reached into the folder again, pulling out another document. "This is a report I compiled. It's a summary of your relationship with Sandra, along with some very damning evidence, screenshots, pictures, even videos from the hotel security cameras." He glanced at Daniel, his voice dropping. "I've already sent copies of everything to your company's board. They'll receive it first thing tomorrow morning." Daniel's face twisted in anger, his fists clenching. "You son of a—" "Careful," Raymond warned, his voice sharp. "You lay a hand on me, and this all gets worse for you. I've made sure that if anything happens to me, the information goes public. You won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything." Sandra's eyes were wide with panic as she reached for Raymond. Her voice was desperate. "Please, Raymond, don't do this. We can talk about it, we can figure something out. You don't have to destroy us." Raymond looked at her, his face devoid of any sympathy. "You destroyed us the moment you decided to sleep with him." He stepped back from the table, his voice steady but filled with finality. Daniel stood up abruptly, his face flushed with fury. "You think you're going to walk away from this without consequences? I'm not afraid of you, Raymond. You don't scare me." Raymond didn't flinch. "You should be scared. I'm not the one who's about to lose everything." There was a tense silence as Daniel glared at Raymond, his hands trembling with rage. For a moment, it looked like he might lunge at him, but something in Raymond's calm demeanor stopped him. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the folder on the table. "Is this what you want, Raymond?" he asked, his voice cold. "To lose everything because you couldn't keep your hands off another man's wife?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Sandra, tears welling up in her eyes, stood from the couch and approached Raymond. Her voice was pleading. "Raymond, please, we made a mistake, but this doesn't have to end like this. I'm sorry. It's too late for apologies." Raymond said, stepping back to keep distance between them. You made your choices. Now you'll face the fallout. Sandra's voice cracked as she tried to hold back the tears. Raymond, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I still love you. Raymond's expression didn't change. Love? You don't even know what that means, Sandra. You betrayed me. Lied to my face for months. And now you expect me to forgive you because you say you're sorry. She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I didn't know what else to do. I was unhappy and I didn't know how to fix it. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, work on us. Raymond shook his head, his voice low but resolute. There's no us anymore, Sandra. You ended that when you brought him into our home. Daniel, still standing by the couch, sneered. You're weak, man. You're too soft to do anything. You think you can ruin me? I'll get out of this. I always do. Raymond turned toward the door, the small black bag still on the table. You won't, he said. And when it's all over, you'll wish you had left quietly. He walked to the door, opening it without another word. The last thing he heard before stepping out was Sandra's quiet sobs and Daniel's frustrated muttering as the door closed behind him. Raymond felt the weight lift from his chest. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. Now it was time to watch everything else crumble. The silence after Raymond's exit hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Daniel was the first to break it. He stood up abruptly, fists clenched, his nostrils flaring as he glared at Sandra, then at the door where Raymond had just left. You think he's bluffing? Daniel asked, trying to regain the swagger he had moments before. His voice was tight, angry, but there was a hint of uncertainty that betrayed his bravado. Sandra was still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the hem of her shirt. She hadn't expected this, not this kind of reaction from Raymond. She had imagined a fight, maybe tears, some shouting, anything but the cold, calculating revenge he had set in motion. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced. He's never been like this before. Daniel scoffed, though it was clear he was starting to doubt his own words. It's just a bunch of empty threats. What could he possibly do? Before Sandra could answer, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the tension. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. His face darkened. What is it, Sandra? Asked her voice, shaky. It's a goddamn email, Daniel muttered, his thumb swiping across the screen furiously as he opened it. His eyes scanned the text. From my office. Sandra leaned forward, fear tightening her chest. What does it say? Daniel's expression twisted with a mixture of anger and panic. They're putting me on administrative leave, pending an investigation, he said. It says they've received complaints about my conduct, and they need to review evidence of inappropriate behavior. Sandra's heart sank. Raymond hadn't been bluffing. He had already made good on his promise to destroy Daniel's career. He wasn't lying, she said softly, barely able to believe it herself. This is impossible, Daniel exploded, pacing around the room like a caged animal. There's no way they could have acted this fast. He's bluffing. It's just a scare tactic. But the evidence was mounting. Raymond had been planning this for months, and Daniel was only now starting to realize how deep it went. Sandra stood up, her hands wringing nervously. We need to talk to him. Maybe there's still a chance to fix this. If we explain, Daniel snapped, his temper flaring, that we're sorry, that we didn't mean for this to happen. He's not going to listen, Sandra, she said. You saw the look in his eyes. He's out for blood. Sandra bit her lip, panic rising in her throat. She had never seen Raymond like this, so calm, so detached. It scared her more than anything. Maybe he'll change his mind. Maybe he just needs time to cool down. Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hard. He's not going to cool down. He's already sent the evidence to my boss. You think he's just going to stop now? No, he's going to ruin both of us. Sandra swallowed hard, realizing the full weight of what they had done. This was no longer just about an affair. It was about everything unraveling around them faster than they could control. What are we going to do? she asked, her voice trembling. Danielle's jaw tightened. We have to get ahead of this. Damage control. I'll call my lawyer and see if there's anything we can do to stop this investigation. Sandra's eyes darted around the room, her thoughts racing. What about me? He said he's filed for divorce. He's going to take everything. Daniel's face softened slightly, and he stepped closer to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure something out. You're not going to be left with nothing. But Sandra wasn't so sure. Raymond had been meticulous. He had gathered evidence, planned his moves, and executed his revenge flawlessly. She could feel everything slipping through her fingers, and the thought of losing everything, the house, the life they had built together, was suffocating. I never thought he would do something like this, Sandra whispered, her voice filled with regret. I thought he'd be angry, but this is something else. Daniel sighed, his hand dropping from her shoulder. Yeah, well, you underestimated him. We both did. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on them. The living room, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a prison. Everything they had taken for granted, Sandra's marriage, Daniel's career, was crumbling in front of them. Daniel's phone vibrated again. He glanced at it, his face contorting in frustration. Another email. They're already setting up meetings to review the evidence. Sandra's panic flared. What are we going to do? Daniel looked at her, his expression grim. We have to get out of here. If Raymond's already made moves against me, there's no telling what else he's planned. Where will we go? I don't know anywhere but here, Daniel muttered, rubbing his face in frustration. He's probably monitoring everything. Sandra felt a cold chill run down her spine. The thought of Raymond watching them, knowing their every move, made her skin crawl. You think he's spying on us? Sandra asked. He's already proven he's been watching, Daniel snapped. Of course he's spying. Sandra's mind raced. We need to go now, before he does something worse. Without another word, Daniel grabbed his jacket from the chair and tossed Sandra her purse. Let's go. They hurried toward the door, but as Sandra reached for the handle, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down and froze. It was a text from Raymond. You can run, but you can't hide. Her heart stopped. She turned to Daniel, her face pale. He knows. Daniel grabbed the phone from her hand. His eyes scanned the message. He cursed under his breath. He's playing mind games. Sandra shook her head, panic gripping her chest. She whispered, No, he's serious. He's going to ruin us. Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. We don't have time for this. Let's go. We'll figure it out later. They rushed out of the house, leaving behind the shattered remnants of Sandra's life. The night air was cold, biting against their skin as they hurried toward Daniel's car, parked down the street. As they got in, Daniel slammed the door shut. His hands trembling, he fumbled for the keys. We'll drive to my place, regroup, and figure out our next move. Sandra nodded, though her mind was still reeling from Raymond's message. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, Raymond would be there, pulling the strings. The car roared to life, and Daniel sped down the empty street, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds as they drove away. Sandra couldn't help but look back at the house that had once been her home, now nothing more than a monument to her mistakes. He'll find us, she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. Daniel didn't respond, his jaw set, his focus on the road ahead. But even he couldn't deny the truth. Raymond had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, and now they were both trapped in a game they couldn't win. As the city lights blurred past, the weight of their actions pressed down on them, suffocating in its finality. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. The days after Raymond's cold, calculated revenge played out in a slow, agonizing blur for Sandra and Daniel. Everything seemed to collapse around them at once, the weight of their actions crushing their futures, piece by piece. It started with Daniel's job. A week after Raymond sent the evidence to his employer, Daniel received a formal notice terminating his contract. His reputation, once sterling in the corporate world, was in ruins. Word spread quickly about his affair, not just within his company but in the industry as a whole. The whispers turned into a full-blown scandal. And soon Daniel was not just unemployed but blacklisted. Every job application he sent out was met with silence. Every phone call ignored. "Try to play it cool at first. It'll blow over," he told Sandra as they sat in his small one-bedroom apartment. The dim lighting made everything feel even more suffocating. "People forget this kind of stuff. I'll be back on my feet soon." But Sandra could hear the desperation in his voice. She watched as Daniel spent hours on his laptop, trying to clean up his online image, sending emails, making calls. He was fighting a losing battle. The shame was too public, the damage too severe. Soon, the frustration turned to anger. "This is all his fault," Daniel snapped one evening, slamming his laptop shut with such force that it rattled the coffee table. "Raymond did this. He ruined everything." Sandra sat across from him, staring blankly at the wall. She felt hollow. "It's not just his fault," she whispered. "We did this to ourselves." Daniel glared at her, his eyes filled with fury. "You were the one who told him. You're the one who brought me into his house." Sandra didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had thought she was in control, that she and Daniel could have it all. But now it was clear she had been wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. Their social circle, once filled with friends and invitations to lavish events, had turned its back on them. People they had once considered close friends were nowhere to be found. Sandra tried calling a few of them, hoping to explain and salvage something, but the responses were cold. "I'm sorry, Sandra, but we can't be associated with this," one friend had said over the phone, her voice dripping with judgment. "People talk, and I can't have this kind of scandal affecting my family." The line had gone dead before Sandra could even plead her case. As the days passed, the isolation deepened. Daniel's apartment, once a temporary escape, now felt like a prison. The once passionate relationship that had consumed them both began to disintegrate under the weight of their mutual blame. Their arguments grew more frequent, more bitter. "This was never supposed to happen," Sandra said one night, pacing the small living room. "We were supposed to be happy, not this." Her voice cracked, tears welling up in her eyes. Daniel sat on the couch, staring at the TV, barely paying attention. "Yeah. Well, we didn't exactly plan on your ex-husband being a psychopath, did we?" Sandra wiped at her eyes angrily. "He's not a psychopath, he's just done with us." Daniel scoffed. "He destroyed us, Sandra. This is way beyond being done. He's enjoying this. He's probably sitting in his new life, laughing at us right now." And Daniel was right. Raymond had moved on, but not out of malice or to gloat. He simply didn't care about them anymore. He had played his cards perfectly, executing his revenge with precision. And now he was free from the lies, the betrayal, the hurt that had haunted him for months. As he watched their lives fall apart from a distance, he didn't feel a sense of victory or triumph, just peace. Raymond sold the house he had once shared with Sandra, using the money to start over in a different city. It was a fresh start, free from the pain that had consumed him for so long. He enrolled in a new gym, made new friends, and focused on his career. He had even started dating again, taking things slow but feeling the weight lift from his shoulders as each day passed. He never looked back. Meanwhile, Sandra's situation worsened. Raymond had filed for divorce immediately after the confrontation, leaving her with nothing. She didn't contest it. There was no point. She knew she had no moral ground to stand on, and the settlement left her without a dime of the comfortable life she had grown used to. The lawyer Raymond hired made sure she wouldn't walk away with anything but her personal belongings. One day, after another heated argument with Daniel, Sandra left his apartment and went for a walk. She wandered aimlessly through the city, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her chest like a boulder. Every corner she turned, every familiar place she passed, reminded her of what she had lost. Her home, her stability, her life with Raymond. Sandra found herself sitting on a park bench watching people go by. Couples held hands, children played, and the world moved on, unaffected by her personal disaster. She felt invisible, irrelevant, like a ghost lingering in a place where she no longer belonged. A soft rain began to fall, but Sandra didn't move. She sat there, staring blankly ahead, feeling the drops soak through her clothes and her hair until she was shivering. She didn't care. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. Back at Daniel's apartment, things weren't much better. The stress of losing his job and his reputation had pushed him to the edge. He had started drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain of his crumbling life. Every day was the same, a blur of whiskey, regret, and resentment. And every time Sandra walked through the door, she could see the anger in his eyes, the way he blamed her for everything. One night, after another argument, Daniel exploded. "You ruined my life, Sandra. I lost everything because of you." Sandra stood in the doorway, stunned. "We both did this," she said quietly. "It's not just me." But Daniel wasn't listening. He grabbed a bottle from the table and threw it against the wall, the glass shattering into pieces. "Get out," he shouted. "Just get out of my life." Sandra didn't argue. She grabbed her coat and left, slamming the door behind her. As she walked down the street, the cold night air biting at her skin, she realized that she had nowhere to go. Her friends had abandoned her. Raymond had moved on, and now Daniel had turned his back on her, too. The fallout from the affair had consumed everything. She had nothing left. In the weeks that followed, Sandra drifted aimlessly through her days, barely holding on. She stayed in cheap motels, living off what little savings she had left, unsure of what the future held. The life she had once known, the life she had taken for granted, was gone. Meanwhile, Raymond flourished. He had cut the toxic ties that had bound him to Sandra's betrayal, and he was thriving. His new job was challenging but rewarding, and his new relationship, while still in its early stages, was healthy and grounded. He had found peace in the chaos, and for the first time in a long time he was genuinely happy. As for Sandra and Daniel, they were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their broken lives. They had destroyed everything in their pursuit of something fleeting, and now they were paying the price. Raymond had won, not because he wanted revenge, but because he had freed himself from their toxic grip. And as they continued to unravel, he moved forward, leaving them behind. Raymond stood at the edge of his new driveway, gazing at the modest but comfortable house that was now his home. The soft breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth, filling the air with a sense of renewal. It wasn't the largest house nor the most luxurious, but it was enough, and more importantly, it was his, free from the shadows of his past. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash over him. The turmoil, the betrayal, the sleepless nights spent wondering where his marriage had gone wrong. They were behind him now. A new chapter had begun. The sound of a moving truck's door slamming brought him back to the present. He turned to see a couple of movers unloading the last few boxes, carefully placing them on the porch. "You're all set here, sir," one of the movers said, giving him a nod. "Anything else we can do for you?" Raymond shook his head. "No thanks. You guys have done enough." The movers tipped their caps and headed back to the truck, leaving Raymond standing alone in front of his new life. He walked over to the porch, picked up the top box, and carried it inside. The house was still mostly empty, the walls bare, but it already felt more like home than the old one ever had in the final months of his marriage. He set the box down in the living room and stood there for a moment, surveying the space. It was smaller than the house he had shared with Sandra, but it felt warmer, more intimate. He liked that there was no need for extravagant, empty rooms. He wanted a place filled with life, with real connections. This time, he would build that for himself. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. Raymond glanced at the screen and smiled. It was Sophie. "Hey, you all settled in yet?" Her voice came through the line, cheerful and light. Sophie had been a constant in his life over the past few months. They had met not long after his divorce was finalized, and while things were still new between them, it felt right. "Just about," Raymond replied, his tone relaxed. "The movers just left. There are still boxes everywhere, but it's starting to feel like home. I can't wait to see it." Sophie said. Maybe I can come over tomorrow and help you unpack. Raymond chuckled softly. You just want an excuse to organize my kitchen, don't you? Absolutely, she replied, laughing. I've seen your cooking. You need help. Raymond smiled, appreciating the ease of their banter. With Sophie, everything felt effortless. There was no drama, no hidden agendas, just honesty and a genuine connection. It was a welcome change from the manipulation and deceit that had consumed his life with Sandra. Tomorrow sounds great, Raymond said, glancing around the house once more. I could use the company. After they hung up, Raymond spent the next couple of hours unpacking, slowly turning the house into a home. Each box he emptied was a step further from the man he had been during his marriage, a man who had clung to a relationship that had been dead long before he realized it. Now he was free to rebuild himself brick by brick. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors. Raymond stepped outside onto the small back patio, the quiet neighborhood surrounding him. It was peaceful here, a world away from the chaos that had once consumed him. He could hear the distant sounds of children playing, birds chirping, and the occasional hum of a lawnmower in the distance. This was the life he had wanted, simple and grounded. His thoughts wandered back to Sandra for a brief moment, but not with the bitterness that had once gripped him. She was a chapter of his life that had ended, and he felt no need to revisit it. He had spent enough time mourning the loss of their marriage, enough energy being angry. Now he simply felt indifferent. Sandra and Daniel were still living with the consequences of their actions. The fallout had hit them harder than either had expected. He had heard through the grapevine that Daniel had been struggling to find work, and that Sandra had moved in with a friend, unable to afford a place of her own after the divorce. But none of it mattered to him now. They were a distant memory, and Raymond was focused on what lay ahead, not what was left behind. He thought back to the final meeting with his lawyer, the satisfaction of knowing he had come out of the divorce with everything he wanted. The house had been sold, the proceeds split, but Raymond didn't care about the money. He had fought for his freedom, not for material possessions, and now he had it. The sky began to darken as evening approached, and Raymond went back inside, deciding to take a break from unpacking. He grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and settled into the couch. There were still boxes stacked against the walls, but for the first time in a long time he didn't feel rushed. He could take his time, set his own pace. He scrolled through his phone, landing on a photo of him and Sophie at a recent dinner. Her bright smile made him smile too. They weren't rushing into anything after all. Raymond was still healing, but he liked the way things were progressing. Sophie understood his need for space, for time, and she never pushed. It was refreshing as he took a sip of his beer. A knock sounded at the front door. Raymond frowned, not expecting anyone. He set the bottle down and walked over, peeking through the small window. It was his neighbor from across the street, an older man with graying hair and a kind smile. Raymond opened the door. "Hey there," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Jim, live across the way. Just wanted to stop by and introduce myself. See if you needed anything." Raymond shook his hand, appreciating the gesture. "Nice to meet you, Jim. I'm Raymond. Just moved in today, so I'm still getting settled." Jim chuckled. "I remember those days. It's a good neighborhood, quiet, friendly folks. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks," Raymond replied, feeling a genuine warmth from the man. Jim gave a nod, glancing behind him at the house. "Looks like a nice place you got here. You like it?" "I think I will," Raymond said. Any minute after Jim left, Raymond closed the door and returned to the couch, feeling content. The evening passed quietly with the soft hum of the television in the background as Raymond lost himself in the peaceful stillness of his new home. The phone buzzed again, and it was a text from Sophie. "Can't wait for tomorrow. I'll bring breakfast." Raymond smiled, typing back a quick response before setting the phone down. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling of calm that had eluded him for so long. This was it, a fresh start, free from the lies and betrayal that had once defined his life. Raymond had emerged from the storm stronger, more resilient. He had learned what he wanted, what he needed, and what he would never settle for again. As the night deepened, Raymond drifted off to sleep, the last remnants of his past fading away into the darkness, leaving only the promise of a brighter tomorrow.